Good evening, and thanks for coming out tonight to join us for our latest Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, and we are here in Greenspun Hall, where we call our second home, and want to thank our colleagues in Greenspun College for allowing us to use this facility, and as you can see, record the event. It'll be up on our website in a few days, as are all our previous lectures. So if you're watching us there or through local public television, welcome as well. We're going to talk about Paris Agreement and get a sort of 101 primer on the Paris Agreement, what it is, what different people think it is, where it is, where it may be going, all subject to change in the next half hour, right? So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. We're extremely pleased to have Samantha Gross out with us from the Brookings Institution. And like our Brookings scholars, she's been, has been and will be in classes. Some of you in this room have had her in a class or two, I suspect. And she'll be visiting classes into the late hours of the night right before she catches her red-eye home, since we have graduate classes well into the evening. She's a fellow in the Cross Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate. Her work is focused on the intersection of energy, environment, and policy, including climate policy and international cooperation, energy efficiency, unconventional oil and gas development, the regional and global natural gas trade, and the energy-water nexus. And like many of our Brookings colleagues, she has an interesting resume, not just purely academic. In her more than 20 years of experience in environmental affairs, her positions include serving as Director of the Office of International Climate and Clean Energy in the U.S. Department of Energy. So we are pleased to have an incredibly qualified speaker to address this topic tonight. So with that, I will welcome Samantha to the podium and not take your talk.
Thanks. That was a very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. And I've also heard a number of you in the room say that you heard Al Gore speak last Friday. So I've got some big speaking shoes to fill, but I'll do the best I can here tonight. So I'm here tonight to talk about climate change. And this is an issue you've heard about on the news more than ever in these past few months. And with the new Trump administration, US policy on climate change has changed substantially. But what difference does this really make? Is this a game changer for the US and for the world or not? And we'll discuss that in the next hour or so. I'll start my talk by describing why climate change is such a bear to deal with from a human instincts point of view. Then we'll walk through the Paris Agreement and why it's such a big deal and a big change from the past. Then I'll say a few words about President Trump's decision to withdraw from Paris. Then I'll end with some more optimistic thoughts about where the world can go from here and how. So we often hear climate change described as one of the great challenges of our age, an inconvenient truth, as someone we all know has said, or with potentially catastrophic effects if it's left unchecked. So why don't we just deal with it already? We know it's a problem. Why is this so hard? And the answer I often give on this is if somebody asked me to try, they gave me the task of finding the most difficult public policy problem I could cook up. I really couldn't do any better than climate change. Burning fossil fuels, oil and gas and coal, it built our modern economy and the way of life that we all enjoy. But it also results in emissions of carbon dioxide, which is harmless in general. It's what helps plants grow. But as the concentrations of carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere, it is very slowly trapping more heat and very slowly making the Earth progressively warmer and warmer on average. And this is a truly global challenge. Emissions anywhere affect climate everywhere. So serious solutions to climate change require changes in our energy system, which can be expensive and require significant research into new technologies. Solutions require investment here and now, with benefits spread everywhere and in the future. To that really difficult stew of things, add a large helping of global conflict between the developed and the developing world. and then sprinkle in a little bit of politicized science and stir. And this is really the recipe for what some of my colleagues call a wicked problem. Exactly the kind that people and governments find really difficult to solve, and the kind that human nature just has a hard time wrapping its brain around. The timeframes that are involved in climate change are decades and centuries, and these don't fit well into the way people think, nor does it fit well into our political cycles, and making climate change especially challenging for politicians as well. You think about why we vote for the people we vote for and how politicians are elected. They're generally elected on bread and butter issues, helping us with our day-to-day problems. We don't often think when we vote, and they don't often think in their own policies about our grandchildren or their grandchildren. So for all of these reasons, the general human inclination on climate change, what we're all inclined to do, is to kick the can. That's human nature. And we've certainly seen a lot of that, both here in the States, in this country, and around the world. So since climate is such a global issue, much of the focus in dealing with climate for the past 25 years or so has really been at the United Nations. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the United Nations body that focuses on climate. And it's been in existence, it got started at the Rio Earth Summit in 1990, and it's been fully formed since about 1992, so this isn't new. But the Paris Agreement that happened almost 2 years ago at the end of 2015 really took on a new approach and really was a game changer for climate. And I'd like to talk a bit about why, and why this is such a really big deal and worth talking about. So in the past, the quest for a global agreement on climate change, it really got hung up on one particular issue, and that is the developed world versus the developing world. So developing, and both sides coming into this argument, they really made valid arguments. Like, everybody had valid points. The developing countries said that the developed industrial world, the United States, Europe, with all our fossil fuel burning and our development, we created this problem and we could darn well pay to fix it. And they had their facts right. The United States has cumulatively emitted more greenhouse gases than any other country over time. They have a point. But on the other hand, developed countries like the United States pointed out that the developing countries, and in particular China, as it's had tremendous economic growth over the past few decades, they're now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And the world can't afford for them to develop like we did by burning fossil fuels. The world just can't put up with that. This is entirely true. The developed countries had a really good point too. This argument between the two parts of the world really hobbled the Kyoto Agreement, the earlier global agreement on climate change, because it only made demands on the developed world. And the US, in the George W. Bush administration, refused to sign on to the Kyoto Agreement for exactly this reason. So I spent a lot of time in Europe during the early part of the Obama administration. I'm talking about various energy and climate issues, and I would often get the question, okay, the US administration has changed. Things are different now. Now are you going to sign Kyoto? And I got tired of telling people over and over again, the US will never sign Kyoto. At the kind of agreement that only took into account a few countries and constrained those was just never going to be politically palatable here in the US, even with the switch over to the Obama administration. But honestly, these things are all true, but the Earth doesn't care. It doesn't matter at all. The emissions, it's a truly global problem. It doesn't matter who emits the carbon, it has the exact same effect. It's very different than a lot of other pollution issues where your local emissions are what really matters. This is truly global, and you need a global approach. There are particularly severe impacts in certain places, like low-lying coastal communities or small island nations, or areas perhaps in the Middle East that may become so hot and dry that they become uninhabitable. Like, to avoid these kinds of catastrophic effects, we needed a global approach, and the world needs to come together. And so in order to move towards this goal, the Paris Agreement really took a different approach than we'd had in the past, with the primary goal of really busting up this intractable problem of the developed versus developing world. We needed to get the world to agree on something, to come up with some sort of framework, even if it was just about, all going in the same direction. So the Paris approach is really different than what came before. What they did is they came up with a bring your own goals strategy. Every country came to Paris and it brought its own pledge to mitigate its own greenhouse gas emissions, or also in some cases to keep natural sinks for carbon dioxide, things like forest cover in the Amazon, for example. So the commitments that countries brought to Paris, they differed tremendously across countries, both in the form of the commitments and also in how ambitious they are. For instance, in some countries, particularly Europe and the United States, we made commitments in terms of absolute reductions. We will cut emissions, X% below a 2005 baseline, at something that you could really quantify in hard numbers. Other countries made commitments that were a little bit softer. Some of them, like India, focused on bringing down the carbon intensity of their economy. We're going to have less carbon per unit of GDP as we go forward, but still allowing for some growth in emissions and economic growth. Or another form of commitment is what China did. China said, we pledge to peak our emissions by a certain date and then level off and go down from there. So they didn't specify a level of emissions, but they specified a date by which they would peak and then come back down. These all together, they were called nationally determined contributions, to use the technical term that the UN used. And these all come together to form the Paris Agreement, the sum total of everything that all these countries brought to the table. In this new bring your own goals strategy, it worked. 195 countries signed on to the Paris Agreement. This is tremendous. It was cause for celebration and something completely new. It's really hard to get the whole world to agree on anything, but they came together and they agreed on this. But I'll point out that there are some, particularly in the really strong environmental community, who have some objections to the agreement and they don't feel like it goes far enough. And I think it's helpful to sort of talk about those and how they play out. The first of those is that those nationally determined contributions, those goals that everyone brought, they're not legally binding. Countries aren't legally bound to meet the goals that they brought forward. You definitely hear complaints that this is a real weakness of the agreement. However, it was a trade-off to get 195 countries to sign on. And it also encouraged countries to be a little ambitious. They didn't, maybe they could stretch a little and do a slightly more ambitious goal because they knew they weren't completely under the gun to meet it. The second weakness / attribute of the deal that gets some attention is the overall goal of this United Nations process is to keep the average global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, what we're all more used to thinking about, with a stretch goal of keeping global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. All these added up commitments that everyone brought to Paris, they don't get us there. They're not enough. They've got quite a ways to go, in fact. The agreement deals with this and anticipated this by saying that countries will come together every 5 years as parties to the agreement to revisit their pledges, with the hope that as technologies get better, as they get cheaper, and as folks can learn from some of the first movers that moved first on new technologies and new policies, that'll allow these pledges to get more ambitious and stricter over time, and in time take us to a 2-degree-C world. So it's an issue, but one that the agreement anticipated and is prepared to deal with over time. The third attribute, weakness, whatever you'd like to call it, is that the agreement doesn't have very much to say about how countries will achieve their goals. What policies or programs or technologies, how these countries will change their energy systems and their economies to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent the worst effects of climate change. This talk about implementation and how do you go from a global agreement to local efforts, I'll come back to that in a few minutes towards the end of the talk. But right now, I want to take a few minutes to turn to the US role in the Paris Agreement. And I want to talk a bit about what it means that the US has announced that it intends to withdraw. I'm really working to keep this talk mostly away from like inherently political or very politicized issues, but I'd be completely remiss in the environment that we're in if I didn't talk about our decision to withdraw and some of the ways that that plays out. So pardon the politics for a second, but this is really important, and there are important things to understand here. I'll start with the bad news. It's always best to get that out of the way. Withdrawal from Paris is really harmful to the US reputation abroad. I'm in the foreign policy program at Brookings, and so I think a lot about how we relate to folks abroad, how these decisions play out abroad. And this is a real challenge for us. Many of our allies, especially in Europe, they care a lot about climate change, and they care a lot about this agreement. And these countries are democracies. How their people feel about us really matters. It can become politically unpopular for those governments to cooperate with the United States, not just on climate issues, but just in general. If your constituents, as a democratic government or representatives, aren't fond of the United States, cooperating with us in general may not be a politically popular thing to do. And there's no upside to that. That's just harmful for us. I would also add that US withdrawal from Paris, it shows us to be a less reliable partner in international agreements. And this could really matter in terms of agreements that we really want on different issues. You think about trade agreements, or even a potential agreement with North Korea on nuclear weapons. Why would you trust us right now? This administration has really shown that it's not fond of multilateral agreements. It's pulling back from many of those kinds of agreements, including Paris. And this has really decreased the world's level in trust with us as a reliable, stable partner. You think about, would you cut a deal with us right now? I'm not sure that you would, given that the administration may change and somebody throws their hands up and says, that's not my deal. So I find that all really unfortunate. The international aspects of pulling out of Paris troubled me way more than the domestic aspects, which I'll get to in a moment. But this was all really unnecessary, which is truly unfortunate. You'll remember that I said just a couple of minutes ago that our commitments under Paris were voluntary. They're not legally binding. So the US is losing this credibility abroad, but we're not really getting much back in return. We weren't bound to meet our commitment in the first place. And so this is just unfortunate. We're giving up a lot and we're not really getting much back. And I'll add that President Trump's speech in the Rose Garden on the 1st of June, when he announced that we were pulling out, it really seemed to be trying to reopen some old wounds. In particular, it very strongly pointed out the differences in the commitments between China and the United States. But that was how the agreement worked. Each country brought what it was willing to do, and we added them up to see what we could get. And so that was part of the plan, and I think it was unfortunate that he chose to dwell on that. But with all that aside, let's set that aside for a moment. And actually one point I forgot. It's a really odd fact, but it's true that it takes 4 years to withdraw from the climate agreement. And so the US actually can't officially withdraw until November of 2020. And completely coincidentally, it's the day after the next election. So I don't know what's gonna happen. Nobody knows what's gonna happen. But the way this is playing out right now is totally fascinating. We're just kind of hanging around the global agreement in a way that's very odd. We're sort of in and out at the same time. What's going on right now, there's a big meeting coming up in Bonn, Germany in about 2.5 weeks. That's the first meeting of what they call the Conference of the Parties. All of the countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement, they do this once a year. And this is the first one that's happened since the US announcement that we're going to pull out. And the US is indeed sending a small delegation. We're still part of the agreement and we're going. I've been to these meetings in the past. They're super interesting. You get an incredible mix of people and you kind of get to see how the sausage is made. But the US generally catches grief at these things in many ways. You know, there are always going to be folks abroad who will challenge our policies and our views on environmental issues, and that's totally normal. But this one's going to be interesting. So I'm not going this year, but I will definitely be watching the news to see what happens. I'll try to talk to people I know who are going because I'm really curious to see how all this plays out. It's going to be fascinating. But leaving that stuff aside for a minute, I want to spend the rest of the time on the speech being positive. I don't want to send y'all home with doom and gloom, and so I have a lot of positive things to say, and I want to go there right now. For starters, the US withdrawal from Paris really doesn't seem to have weakened the commitments of other important countries, and two really important ones to the future of our climate, China and India. They're still on track to meet their goals. And the US was really central to bringing China into the agreement. The US and China very quietly cut a deal, and they announced their nationally determined contributions, their goals, together. And they announced them really early in the process, which kind of got the ball rolling and showed that these two historical powers that had quite different opinions on previous climate agreements were coming together and supporting this process. It was huge. This is super important. And China's sticking to its guns on its agreement, which is fantastic. In the meantime, they've really discovered that they're getting local air quality benefits from moving away from coal. I've been in Beijing on days where you can chew the air. So, I mean, this is a really big deal to their local population. They're also seeing an economic benefit from being a leader in clean energy-related manufacturing. The Chinese and many other countries, they're staying in because they feel like it's in their best interest to stay. There's not a line of people following, or countries following the US out of the agreement, which feels good. On the US side, I'll also add that there's not going to be a perfectly US-shaped whole in global climate efforts. President Trump's decision has really increased the resolve of many states and cities to continue and even redouble their efforts. These subnational efforts, they don't officially represent the US in the UN process. But they're demonstrating to the world that there are many layers of government and many people in the US who are still really involved in fighting climate change. They're still in. There'll even be an American pavilion at the upcoming event in Bonn. The US usually has a national pavilion, and it's a place where you have various speakers and various things highlighting efforts that are happening in the US. And there will be an American pavilion, but it won't be sponsored by the US government. They've pulled out of that process. It instead will be US states and cities at this pavilion highlighting what they're doing, even with the federal administration having pulled back somewhat. So it's really interesting that this is continuing with a slightly different focus. US states and cities also participate in a lot of international efforts, not necessarily the Paris process, because that's focused at the country level, but at other processes where states and cities get together to work on policies, things like the C40 group of the world's largest cities. Last week, the administration announced that it was rescinding the Clean Power Plan, and this was one of the main policy mechanisms that was in place so we could reach the US climate goal. It's unfortunate that this happened, but state and local efforts will help to fill the gap. Like there's definitely, it's not that all effort towards cleaner power or cleaner energy in the US is stopping. There are plenty of efforts that continue on. Adding another positive note, this is more about industry and less about government. The general public, as I was talking about earlier, is really lousy about thinking about these long-term, long-effect kinds of issues. But the energy industry is used to that. They have to think in a longer time horizon. They're making investments that last 30 or 40 or 50 years. And the 4 years of a presidential administration is not a long time for them. It's actually short in the timeframes that they're used to thinking about. They're used to thinking about how to stay profitable and how they will fit into the economy over the lifetime of the kinds of investments they're making, like a very large oil field or a power plant. And so this kind of thinking is not new to them. And for this reason, industry is not really changing big investment decisions all that much based on the change in the US federal administration. I was at a conference recently where the CEO of a large power company got up and said that he doesn't base his strategy on tweets. I was stunned to start out with. I couldn't believe he said it. But I mean, this was a really thinly veiled swipe at what the administration is doing and how he was approaching his business based on what had changed in Washington. So I'm not sure everyone feels as strongly as that particular executive did, but you're not seeing a complete change in course in the energy industry because of what's happened in Washington in the last few months. Okay, so I opened this talk by describing climate change as a wicked problem, and I really like that expression. Some people I work with in the Hartwell group out of Europe coined that term, and I like it a lot. And I also noted that the pledges made in Paris aren't enough to keep the Earth to less than 2 degrees Celsius of warming. But I want to wrap up sort of the formal part of this talk by talking about where we go from here and what big international agreements like Paris can do, and then what they actually can't do very well and what we need other mechanisms to do. And how we might move towards the deep decarbonization and the changes in our energy economy that the world needs to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And this is fundamentally an optimistic topic. It's a good way to kind of wrap up the talk overall. So big international agreements like Paris, they're necessary. They're really important for setting the direction, the overall goals, establishing the idea that this is a global problem and the world cares about it. They're not as good at implementation. The nitty-gritty of applying policy and technology and figuring out exactly how to reduce emissions in different places. The UN's not good for that. The UN's a consensus-based organization, and it's good for what it's good for. But they're not going to be able to agree on those nitty-gritty details of implementation. The kinds of things that make sense depend on the shape and size of your economy. They depend on the energy system that you start with. And sort of a lowest common denominator that you might be able to reach in a UN kind of implementation agreement is just not enough. So you hear sometimes that the argument, well, the Paris goals aren't stringent enough. They're not getting us to where we're going. So we need more ambitious global goals. We need a more ambitious Paris agreement. But those more ambitious goals would be totally meaningless if we didn't have a concrete plan to implement them. And those aren't going to happen right now, and they're not going to happen all at once globally. So in my opinion anyway, global agreement is super important, and I'm grateful that we have it, and we have this framework and this directional agreement. But it's done about what it can do right now. So I want to make the argument that now that this is in place, it's time now to think about different kinds of action in agreement, different kinds of groups and different kinds of goals. So given the size and scope of the climate challenge, breaking it into smaller, more digestible portions makes a lot of sense. I think of the joke about how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. We need to start thinking about taking on the climate element, smaller bites at a time. And I can propose a few different ways to approach that. The first is in smaller groups of actors, made of countries or states or cities. They're more able to make ambitious goals and to take stronger actions to meet them. They're in a better position to do that than the great big UN process. Smaller groups in similar situations can band together. They can test drive innovative policies and technologies. Even though climate change is the ultimate global problem, all the fixes don't have to happen at the global level, and they won't happen at the global level. The top 3 countries account for half of global emissions, and the G20 group of countries accounts for 90%. So you can do a lot of work by dealing with much smaller groups of countries. It makes sense to do this. You can start working in coalitions of the willing, if you'll pardon the term. Work where countries and people are willing and able to do things. And a lot of this is happening now. You see this in some well-known groups with much wider mandates, like the G7 or the G20. And you also see it in groups that were formed specifically to deal with climate change and clean energy, like the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, or like the Clean Energy Ministerial, which my office used to run when I was at DOE. These kinds of solutions, they aren't a sideshow or like a second best solution to the Paris process. This is how we'll create new progress that the Paris process can then build on, particularly as countries every 5 years make their goals more ambitious, hopefully. These aren't a weak substitute. They're what we need to move the Paris process forward. Another sort of more bite-sized way to look at the climate, a little more digestible, is to think about focusing on specific pollutants that are perhaps a little easier. Carbon dioxide is the main issue in climate change, but other pollutants are important contributors too. I'll particularly talk about methane and about black carbon or soot, like you'd see out of a diesel engine. These are good places to start because their emissions don't just help the climate. They're also really important local air pollutants. They have real impacts on human health and people's lives locally. And they're also technically easy to deal with. You don't necessarily have to go to the heart of our combustion-based energy system to deal with methane emissions or black carbon emissions. There are other things you can do. Add to that, they're actually stronger forcers of the economy. They're more efficient greenhouse gas pollutants than carbon dioxide. So you can really make a difference by focusing on these other pollutants. It's easier to keep people on board to work on emissions of pollutants that affect them now where they live, with effects that they can, in the terms of soot and black carbon, they can see. So we need to make progress on climate where and when we can, and we need wins that we can then build on. And I think focusing on some of these short-lived but very powerful climate pollutants is an important place to start. And there are also international groups that are focusing on these issues, particularly the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So in addition to taking on the climate in little bite-sized chunks, I have one more thought about where progress will occur. It's a place where I'm optimistic, but it's outside the structure of the Paris Agreement. The huge changes that we need in our economy and in our infrastructure to greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they'll only really take off when they're economic. When somebody can make money doing this, it will become completely unstoppable. That's the key. We need these things to be affordable, reliable, and ready to go. As soon as somebody can make money off of it, they will. And we get there with research into renewable and low carbon energy, into electricity storage to make intermittent sources of energy more reliable. Basic research is something that private industry is not very good at. The incentives just aren't there for the private sector to do this really basic science research. Basic science is too risky for businesses. They don't know if they're going to get something that can be commercialized. They don't know how they might commercialize it. And even if they make a major breakthrough, it's really hard for a single business to reap all the benefits of like a basic science breakthrough. So private industry really underinvests in basic science. The incentives aren't right, and it's kind of not what they're good at. But these aspects make this a really great place for government. Think about it. I'm just throwing out an example that I know everyone is familiar with. DARPA. Whoops. I don't want to let that person in. They want to come in really badly. So DARPA, a defense agency based on research that does really basic research to support the US military. DARPA did the really basic research that created the internet. But once it was clear that money could be made in the internet, government support for internet research was completely not necessary anymore. You had companies like Google take it and run with it. The same thing could happen for clean energy, but the private sector is likely to underinvest in that really basic research. Costs for wind and solar have already come down substantially, but breakthroughs in the basic science that drives these technologies is hard for the private sector to do. And these could totally change the economics. There's a great deal of money to be made there, but research is not likely to be supported sufficiently by the private sector. Other areas, Large-scale electricity storage is like the holy grail for renewables, allowing wind and solar to be reliable and available all the time. Somebody could make a fortune figuring this out. But the very nitty-gritty battery chemistry, what's the most efficient way to store electricity and how are we going to figure that out? That's the kind of research that's really hard for the private sector to do. Nuclear is another issue. I know it's a tough sell here in Nevada, but if we think about ways to do nuclear power better, in particular, instead of building a nuclear plant from scratch on each site, which is wildly expensive, what if we did smaller plants that we could manufacture the components for and make them much more cheaply? Again, that takes research to find ways to do those kind of reactors and perhaps ones that make less waste, which I know is a big issue in this part of the world. Universities around the world and national labs in other countries and the ones we have here, these are the places where this takes place. And it takes place in large part with federal money. It's absolutely crucial that government support these people, the work that they do. And this is absolutely crucial to a low energy future. And I'm concerned when I see anyone in government talk about pulling back. And I think the original, when Trump came out with his skinny budget a while back, it was quite negative towards research. And I think Congress is really going to turn that around because I think a lot of them realize the value of science. And I also, just from a plainly political point of view, those labs and universities are scattered all over the country. There's money and jobs and investment in all of those areas. And so I don't think those changes will happen. I think we'll continue our support for research. But when you're voting and thinking about what can I do for climate, a really important thing that you can do is whenever the opportunity arises, support science. This is what's going to bring us the future. So I'll wrap up by saying that climate change is definitely a wicked problem. And it's not something that humankind will be able to solve easily or quickly. But I'm basically an optimist. Otherwise, I'd crawl under the desk in my office, call it a day. And I think my optimism is justified. If we work on pockets of innovation and willingness to try new things, and then we build outward and upward from there. And also if we continue the research and development that has brought us so many other useful technologies. When you think about the computing power you carry around in your pocket, it's greater than what took men to the moon. Like, we've seen breakthroughs of this scale before. We just need to keep going. I see two diametrically opposed views when I look at the media and I hear what people talk about climate. On the one side, you have the climate skeptics. And we don't really believe this is happening. And we see complete economic ruin if we push towards dealing with this issue. But on the other side, you have those who think dealing with climate change is cheap and easy. Technologies are here now, and the only reason why we're not doing it is because there are evil forces preventing it, particularly the fossil fuel lobby, keeping us away from a clean energy transition. And I think after listening to me for the past 40 minutes or so, you probably realize that I don't believe either of these extreme views. I'm definitely a centrist on this, and I think the world needs more centrists and less shouting from these opposite poles, neither one of which makes a lot of sense. I don't think a transition away from fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions will be cheap or easy or quick. But I do think that this kind of transition is possible, practical, and necessary. And I look forward to watching how it plays out, what new technologies we find, what the scientists bring us. And I hope by giving talks like these and doing the kind of work that I do, that I can be a little tiny bit of the solution. So I want to thank you for your attention. This has been fun. I'm happy to take questions, and thanks much.
Who would like to get us started with a question or two? Sir?
Can you, I'm sorry, were you pointing?
Yes.
Can you possibly explain what China's role is in the development of science, the basic science that you were talking about? Are they doing it?
They're doing some of it, yeah. So I think more than we kind of have the impression here that they frankly take our technology and run with it and make it cheaply. There's more to it than that. They are definitely working on basic science because they, particularly in the solar realm, they've really realized that if they can combine better science with their manufacturing capability, they're world beaters. Electric vehicles, I didn't talk much about transportation, but electric vehicles are another place where China is really busting out and they want to lead. They're pushing for electric vehicle policy. There are a lot of serious companies in China working on electric vehicles, and they're more of a leader than a follower or a sucker up of old technology in that area, for sure.
Sir?
Yeah, and great, congratulations, very good. And I think one of the more immediate facets of climate change destruction, it has to do with the areas of drought, famine, and health impacts. And I think you alluded to a little bit to the health impacts, but the drought and famine things are very important. And more science, we can look at aquifers, we can take satellite pictures that show how far Lake Mead's down and, other aquifers. But the water table destruction is amazing. And we don't really have very good or consistent data in a lot of areas. And I think that's one of the things that would really help us, and that is a short-term as well as a long-term issue. I mean, I know in some parts of California they've measured 100-foot drops with this latest drought. But anyway, about that.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little because I actually have done some work on water resources issue. I focused the talk tonight more on sort of the solution, whereas I think this is more the problem side. I'll add, when you think about the effects on water resources of climate, the climate models are getting better and better at talking about sort of large-scale effects. They're not as good at predicting what will the impact of climate change be in Las Vegas, Nevada, or any other specific spot on the globe. That level of resolution is actually quite hard, and so it's hard to do that. So some places are actually likely to get wetter, some places are likely to get drier. I think what you saw in California may be indicative of some of the things we expect to see in the future. You saw a nasty drought, and then it rained like crazy, and you had landslides and all the various problems you get when it rains too much in California. We may be looking at more intense weather in general, with more energy in general in the atmosphere as it gets warmer. So it's hard to say what direction that will go, and it'll be different in different places. And a lot of the water resources you see now with the drop in water table in California and in tons of places in the world, it's not unique to there. We've been kind of operating on borrowed time in many places in the water system around the world for years. A lot of that water, we're pulling it out faster than it's being replenished. And so it's essentially, it's like a fossil fuel. It's like fossil water. We're not allowing that resource to replenish, even though it is technically replenishable. And so that's a slightly separate issue from climate change, but definitely something that we need to think about. And you need to think about how you manage resources in this climate that may look different. A 100-year storm may not be a 100-year storm anymore. And you may have stronger storms and stronger droughts than you've seen in the past. So as we deal with the separate but related problem of water, you have to think about how weather systems might change. It adds another layer of difficulty.
Sir?
What do you think the impact will be on the climate with the change from the U.S. being a net importer of LNG to now being an exporter around the world?
It depends a lot. I have a couple of thoughts about that. One of them is whether natural gas is good or bad in general. The question is always compared to what? If that natural gas goes to, say, China and replaces the emissions from a coal plant, I'm pretty good with that. If it's replacing natural gas that might have come from pipeline in a more efficient way, that might have more of an impact. So it depends on what that natural gas is displacing. Another thought with natural gas is it really depends on how it's produced. It's well regulated here. Some may that's something we can fight about later if you want. But it is generally pretty well regulated in the States, and the methane regulations have survived the Trump administration. Those have come through because they were far enough along in the process that they couldn't easily be rescinded. So methane is natural gas, and methane is a really strong climate pollutant. So however you produce the natural gas, run it through your LNG plant, run it through pipelines, you don't want to release methane. You can completely negate the benefits of using natural gas if you emit too much methane in the process. So one thing I feel comfortable about with natural gas that comes from here is that it's well regulated. Again, compared to what? So the climate impact of the LNG industry here just isn't clear. It depends on what it's displacing and on the kind of methane emissions and coal replacement and that sort of thing you might be seeing from somewhere else. There's not a really obvious thumbs up or thumbs down on it.
Yes, so many questions and thoughts. I don't want to hog too much time, but I think it's interesting that you describe early scientific research as an investment in the future, but then switch to rebuilding our infrastructure as a cost, when actually it's an economic positive anyway. So I think that the use of the language should change whenever they talk about the cost of renewable energy. Instead, describe it as the investment that it actually is, and that it produces net economic benefits anyway.
Yeah, and I agree with that. The one time where that gets a little challenging is if you look at the rate at which we need to turn over the energy sector to get to where we need to be on climate, it's faster than we would naturally turn over that infrastructure. And so we do have to think of the cost, and you could certainly balance this out with benefits, but a lot of people will see that cost of perhaps retiring assets before you might have earlier, or of changing the shape. I didn't talk about this either, but when you think about where renewable energy is and where it might come from geographically, it looks quite different than where we might build power plants otherwise. And so you end up changing the shape of the distribution system and moving power around differently, and that's going to require some infrastructure. It's definitely an investment in a clean energy future, but it does cost money.
Right.
So.
Warren Buffett, of course, not only Mid-America Energy, but they own NV Energy here. But I saw an article on Electric Today that he's already repowering many of the wind power resources in the Midwest long before their expected lifetime is worn out, because economics have turned so quickly.
Yeah.
So we need to keep in mind that geometric growth is our friend when it comes to that.
Yeah.
And I should mention a certain gentleman in California who's working very hard to make large changes in the world as well. When you talk about battery storage, he's made some extraordinary promises with Puerto Rico. And we would do well to keep our eye on that part.
Yeah, I hope he succeeds. I have great hope, particularly with the system in Puerto Rico, where having a more distributed system could do a lot of good. I hope it works.
I would keep in mind that he's proven the pessimist wrong more often than not.
Did I see a question over here, sir?
Ma'am, can you talk about how, even though the U.S. is planning on pulling out, but states themselves are holding firm, how close is that to what the states were going, what the government was going to do?
Yeah, and it's funny, I don't have hard data on this. I wish I did. Some of my colleagues are actually working on a study now, looking at the commitments that states and cities have made, how viable they are, whether they're promising things that they actually have mechanisms to deliver, and trying to figure out how close we can get. And so I don't have hard data on that. I will say that it varies a lot state for state, and it varies somewhat on the politics of different states. Some states have more serious renewable policy, or they just have better renewable resources that makes this more possible. And I would say that this doesn't necessarily break along the red-blue lines that we're all used to thinking about. Some of the biggest renewable energy states that we have right now are traditionally red states. Texas and Oklahoma have tremendous wind industries. And I don't see them backing away from that for any reason. People are making money building those. Also, North Carolina has the second largest amount of installed solar capacity. It's just behind California. So you see some of these things happening, and you may see some strong contributions to reductions happening in places you might not expect. So that's something that we're working on. I wish I had better numbers for you. My gut feeling is we won't get all the way to the Paris commitment, but there'll be a solid wedge there that we get done. And watch this space for a study that's actually going on that right now.
My question is a fun question, but first I wanted to say that I really enjoyed the information you shared. It was really well organized, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And my question is if there is a book that you would recommend in general, just a book that you like about climate change. Or two.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of the stuff that I read, it takes a while to write a book, to overstate the obvious. So I tend to follow a lot of different blogs. So is it okay if I recommend some blogs that you should sort of plug into? I'm going to put a plug for my blog because I can do that. I'm in front. The Brookings has a blog called Planet Policy, which is terrific. I write for it a lot. A lot of my colleagues write for it a lot, and we're super topical because it's a short form. We get a lot of stuff out. There's also a plug for where I went to school. The UC Berkeley Energy Center, pardon me for talking about another university, they do great stuff. The guy who taught me much of what I know is there, and he does some really terrific blog posts that are understandable and yet thorough. They do a great job there. On a more mainstream media, the New York Times climate coverage is great. I've met a couple of their reporters, and they do a really good job of digging into issues and describing things. They do some great graphics. And so rather than like a book that will be out of date when it's done, I would follow those, and I would follow them regularly.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
At the risk of sounding biased, let me
Please plug.
second your plug for the Brookings blog. I don't write for it, so I can plug it to my heart's content. But
What was the name of it again?
The Brookings blog is called Planet Policy. Yeah, it's one of the things that I sort of keep up. For those of you to put in another plug, because I'm here, we also have a series of podcasts that is generally pretty balanced and super interesting, talking about policy in this administration. It's called 5 on 45. It's 5 minutes on the 45th president, and they're little short bite-sized chunks. But on whatever's interesting, pertinent, what's happening in the world, it's a good thing to subscribe to if you want to get a better understanding about what's going on in Washington right now and what it might mean. So I listen to them all the time in addition to recording them occasionally, and it's great.
Sir?
Yeah, so I don't mean to hog up the time either, so I might say more than I want to, but basically my question is about the immediacy of it all, and you mentioned that you think that it's a process, this transition to renewable energy, that would take a considerable amount of time, that you don't think it would be fast. Well, I was wondering what you thought of the idea that that it is an urgent thing, and of the solution of perhaps thinking about more intense solutions, like completely restructuring our economic system to mainly be around the ecology of the planet and the ecosystems in which we live. Because an article came out not too long ago in New York Magazine that talked about a lot of the possible effects of climate change that we might see in the next century that involve things like the desertification of large amounts of arable land, the flooding of and submersion of large areas like Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is one of the most overpopulated cities in the world. And I was wondering about your perspective on the about more intense and more critical solutions.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. And you look at what could happen if we continue on the path we're on without doing anything for the next 100 years, and it's catastrophic. And it's often catastrophic for the people who can least deal with it. Like Bangladesh is a great example. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a very populous, very low-lying country. This is real for them. Or like the small island states, like they're facing not existing anymore. Like this is really an existential threat. And I don't mean to be a downer by saying it won't be quick, but the problem, and this goes back to my opening of why this is so hard. The energy system is the absolute basis of our modern economy. It's how we get around. It's what's powering my microphone. It's how you got here today. It's how this building was built. Absolutely everything that we do every day depends on the modern energy system. I'm not saying we don't need to turn it around quickly. I'm kind of saying that we can't. You look at trillions of dollars of infrastructure, and it just takes time to turn it all over. I've given talks. I don't have my cell phone on me, so I can't hold it up as a prop. But I've had people ask me, I get a new iPhone every 18 months. What's the energy system's problem? And you think about that. You think about the infrastructure that goes into the power plants, the roads, the gas station that you might have stopped at earlier today. it's completely different than turning over an iPhone, and it takes a long time. The thing that we need to do is, as we're making decisions, as you're building new things, as you're replacing old ones, we need to do it better every time. And it's not just in the energy system. Like, something I've started thinking about lately, and I need to look into it, is you think about what happened in Puerto Rico or what happened in Houston. A lot of buildings were destroyed. Buildings are really important users of energy. And if you're taking an old building and you're building a new one, you can do it better. You can integrate the lighting systems and create less heat, so you need less HVAC system. There's a lot of things you can do to make a building use a lot less energy. So and you see very rapidly growing cities, particularly in the developing world, or you see places where disasters have wiped stuff out. We've got to do that better. It's horrible. It's a human suffering, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity to do better. And so as we replace things, we build new. As disasters happen, we need to always think, how can we do the latest and greatest and best, and how can we look forward and not go back to what we've done in the past? I wish I was more optimistic about fast, really I do, but in reality, it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a long time because of the trillions of dollars of investment that are wrapped up in it.
But these are disruptive events where change can occur quickly.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
we
yeah.
can see how quickly that American industry can change with the efforts of World War II and other things.
Oh yeah, and if there's an imperative, like something like World War II, or something like the internet, if there's money to be made, people will do it.
So we just need to declare war on the environment.
I'm not sure I like that idea very much. But seriously, I mean, I'll wrap up with this comment. I've had people sort of describe me as very crass. People, environmentalists, and I mean, I run with a fairly green crowd, and I've had people complain that I've worked for oil companies, that I've taken their money. I'm like, would you rather I didn't? And I'll come back to that. Some people sometimes find it crass that I'm like, this is going to happen when people can make money at it. But it's true. You look at what governments can do, what nonprofits can do. They have money, and we think about the federal budget, and it looks like a big number. It's spitting in the ocean compared to the overall global economy and what private businesses and what all of us can do as we spend money in the economy. And so government needs to set up the playing field. Government needs to set regulations. There are places where government absolutely has a role, particularly in basic research. But this will really take off, and the world will get better when people can make money doing it. And that's the ultimate goal. It's not crass, it's just true.
Well, that's probably a great note to end the talk on. Let me thank you for helping us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Through this
Thank all you for coming.
complex. Thank you both for coming out and for your great questions. We'll be around for a few more minutes if you want to stay. And do not come back next week because we won't be here. But our next lecture is in 4 weeks, actually. And we'll be addressing another global topic. We'll have a colleague out, Danny Bahar, who will talk about global economic development. So there'll be a relationship. Excuse us. So again, in 4 weeks for our next lecture, and if you're on our listserv and our emails, you'll hear about it. So thank you.
We'll come talk to you afterwards.
And come on back and see us again.
Thank you.